Storyteller Margaret Wilston shared this experience. One day she went to visit a friend, and when she walked in the front door, she could hear her friend's 6-year-old son, John, upstairs kicking and screaming and throwing things. The mother explained that he had disobeyed one time too many and had been sent to his room without his supper. Margaret asked if she could go upstairs and see if there was something she could do. The mother didn't think it would do any good, but agreed to let her try. As she entered the bedroom, she found John curled up in a heap at the foot of the bed. He didn't even look up at her. She seated herself on the floor and proceeded to say, "I think I'll tell you a story. You needn't listen, of course. Away up in the far north, where it is very, very cold, there lived a little boy who had a sled. Now, he didn't pull this sled with a rope. Oh, no, he hitched it to 4 little dogs, and how they would fly over the snow." By this time, John was facing her and had stopped kicking. Slowly and quietly, the storyteller unfolded the story of little Jimmy Standby of Labrador, who had stood by the dogs all through the night and the day in the bitter cold because he had promised Dr. Grenfell he would stand by. As the story progressed, John crept closer and closer to her until he had crawled up in her lap, his face eagerly looking into her face as he followed Jimmy Standby to the very end. When the storyteller stood up to leave, John said, "Please, will you ask my mother if I can come downstairs for just a moment? There's something I need to tell her." After some coaxing, the mother agreed, and John, with his dirt-streaked little red face, came down the stairs and said, walking right up to his mother, "She told me a nice story, and I want you to know I'm going to have a name like his. I'm going to be Jimmy Standby, too." And he walked upstairs like a man. Stories are the most powerful tools you have to open your child's heart once the language of words is opened up. A story converts words into moving images, which the heart can now recognize and connect to feelings. In fact, stories help awaken feeling. The interesting thing is your heart recognizes the story, even though the mind can't define one. I've looked online for a proper definition, and I have yet to find an entirely satisfying one. I work with the children at church on Sundays, and I can tell you little children recognize a story because I've watched 60 active little children poking their neighbor, sticking their heads through the chairs and moving non-stop, who suddenly stop and sit at attention with every eye glued to the storyteller up front once she starts telling the story. They sit motionless, almost as though they have been carried off to another place as they live the events unfolding to their hearts. It's almost like a magic spell has been cast over them. By the way, I've seen the same thing happen to a roomful of adults. If you look up story in the dictionary, it says narrative. Okay, here's a narrative. John went to the store to buy some milk, and then he came home again. It's got the moving images, but it hardly engaged your heart, right? It's a narrative, but not a story. Let's try again. John went to the store to buy some milk, and then he came home again. But as he pulled into his dark driveway, he noticed that someone had been following him, and whoever it was had pulled up right behind him and turned off their lights. Now your heart has been engaged, and it wants to know what happened, and it won't let go of the story until it knows. When children start talking, you can add in this 4th language of the heart, story. Let the first stories be about mommies, daddies, and babies and animals, the familiar things. Tell them about things that happened to you when you were a little girl or when Grandma was little. Tell them Aesop's fables. They're short and they're about animals. They've been around for a really long time for a reason. Don't worry if they don't yet understand the moral of the story. It will come. The 3 stories are just right for 3-year-olds. The 3 bears, the 3 little pigs, and the 3 billy goats gruff. Because little children love familiar things, they'll ask you to tell the same story over and over again, and you better tell it the way they heard it the first time, or they'll let you know. Soon they'll know the stories by heart as well. I so enjoyed listening to 3-year-old Emma take her turn for bedtime stories one night while she told the entire story of the 3 bears by heart, complete with the mother bear's tisk, tisk, tisk. Listening to stories help children develop the habit of attention, unlike the 2-second sound bites of Sesame Street. It begins to train them to sustain thought long enough to draw out an idea. And most importantly, as I keep saying, stories help children learn to create images from words. The stories you tell by heart will make the deepest impression. Storytelling in the home is becoming a lost art. We read lots of books to children, mostly picture books, but we don't tell them the stories. When their minds don't have to work to create any of the imagery, the impression isn't as long-lasting or as meaningful. The childhoods of many of the great men and women of history were filled with stories. Often it was the grandmother or elderly aunt who was the storyteller, and they could tell hundreds of stories by heart. Stories were told while they worked, while they ate, and when they went to bed. A revival in the art of storytelling was attempted 100 years ago, and while it didn't last, the books they wrote for the cause did. Many books were published at that time for the purpose of teaching young mothers and teachers of young children how to tell stories. The books included many ready-to-tell stories, mostly drawn from classic stories. Story groups were formed nationwide to practice the art. I read as many of these books as I could get a hold of and tried to distill down the essence of what I learned in a book, Restoring the Art of Storytelling in the Home, which you can find on our storytelling page. It's meant to be a beginning manual for storytellers, but its true value is in the more than 100 stories I collected, which had been prepared by the storytellers for telling. You may wonder why I included some basic nursery rhymes at the beginning of the story section, and that's just to give you a sampling of rhymes to practice sharing by heart without looking at the book. Our generation has grown so dependent on the written word, it's an easy place to start for some people who need that practice. At the back of the book, I've listed dozens of books you can look up on Internet Archive if you want to study it more in depth. I've linked my top 5 favorites on the storytelling page. I've even included some ideas for starting your own story groups for practicing storytelling on the storytelling page. Storytelling really isn't rocket science. Here's my 30-second crash course in storytelling basics. First, love it. Never tell a story you don't love. Then see it. Stories are told from images stored in your heart, not from memorized words. Third, aim it. Know where your story is heading, and only include events that lead you there. 4, shorten it. Most stories are too long. Attention to a story is held by its action. Stories get bogged down in too many descriptive details or detours. Keep it moving forward. Then, tell it. Don't interrupt the emotional flow of the story by asking questions. Questions are for the intellect. Stories are for the heart. And then stop. When you get to the end of the story, stop. To supply the moral of the story is like explaining a joke. Either it worked or it didn't. Complete silence will do more to drive the meaning of the story into the heart than any words you can say. Let the child lead the way. While it may take generations before we regain the reservoir of stories our great-great-grandmothers had, it's a worthy goal to work towards. Around ages 3 to 4, start bridging into the imaginative years with stories that are partly familiar and partly imaginative, such as Beatrix Potter's Bunny stories, Raggedy Ann and Andy stories, and good old Uncle Wiggily. Uncle Wiggily isn't as well known today as he was in the past. He's a kindly rabbit who is always getting into scrapes that teach children important lessons. But mostly he's a very silly rabbit, which many kids love. And now, if the rubber plant doesn't reach too far and tickle the goldfish under the chin to make it sneeze, I'll tell you that you'll find lots of young children's stories in the Young Children Online Library in the Story Hour series. Now we're ready to enter the imaginative years, which are around ages 4 to 8. These are the years for imagination, or in other words, for increasing the capacity of the mind to visualize and create images of things which it has never seen before. Nothing has ever been created or accomplished that didn't first exist as a vision or image in someone's mind. As I said before, the highest civilizations have been the ones with the greatest capacity to visualize. As the Bible says, without vision, the people perish. Felix Adler made an interesting observation. Much of the selfishness of the world is not due to actual hard-heartedness, but to a lack of imaginative power. the faculty of putting oneself in the place of others. My daughter was just telling me that 5-year-old Emma has for weeks in every one of her prayers said, "Please bless us to have good imaginations." My daughter has no idea where that came from. All I can say is from the mouths of babes. When it comes down to it, imagination with its visions and dreams and capacity to empathize really is what the world needs. Fairy tales and mythology are the perfect foods for feeding the imagination, as children are carried to lands and places their eyes have never seen. Albert Einstein advised, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. I know some mothers who refuse to tell fairy tales to their children. They insist on fact alone, or they're uncomfortable telling their children about wicked stepmothers and cutting off giants' heads and pushing witches into ovens. Perhaps they fail to recognize the great gift that has traveled to them over hundreds and even thousands of years. Many of the stories endured because they are wrapped around a kernel of truth. The years have bumped off and smoothed the edges and refined the stories. No one knows their origins, but I suspect many, though not all, were planted in hearts of children long ago by a loving Heavenly Father as a means of teaching His children the ways of happiness. You find the same threads of truth in stories in cultures all over the world: Arabian, Russian, Greek, African, and Chinese. I love these words of Thackeray. There is no calculating the distance through which the stories come to us, the number of languages through which they have been filtered, or the centuries during which they have been told. Many of them have been narrated almost in their present shape for thousands of years since, to little copper-colored Sanskrit children listening to their mother under the palm trees by the banks of the yellow Jumna, their Brahmin mother who softly narrated them through the ring in her nose. The very same tale has been heard by the Northmen Vikings as they lay on their shields on dock, and by Arabs couched under the stars on the Syrian plains when the flocks were gathered and the mares were picketed by the tents. Imagine a baton relay where the baton has successfully been passed off for thousands of years. Would you like to be the one who drops it? Yet that's what our generation's doing. No one has had access to the stories like we have, and yet it's our generation that is leaving them untold. From my notes, the child who is brought up entirely on fact loses the joys and fine feeling offered to him through imagery. It's from the rich heritage of fairy tales that the young heart is impressed with proper ideas and a sense of good and evil, right and wrong, justice and injustice. Charles Kingsley wrote that fairy tales are for beauty and wisdom and truth, and for making children love noble deeds and trust in God to help them through. The stories are not all true, of course. You are not simple enough to fancy that. But the meaning of them is true, and true forever, and that is, do right, and God will help you. Through fairy tales, these ideas are delivered in a way the heart understands. I was just in a group discussion about whether the story of Hansel and Gretel was appropriate to read to young children. Several of the mothers expressed they don't want to give images like that to their little children, and so they only read stories that are safe and where everyone is good. A couple of thoughts come to my mind. One is that our grown-up minds are not the same as a child's mind. My grown-up mind judges Hansel and Gretel as a horrible story. What parent would possibly think of taking their own children out in the forest and leaving them because they can't afford to feed them anymore? Only the monsters in our society would do that. Why would I even tell such a story? But then my little 4-year-old mind remembers the story. I loved that a big brother would care so much for his little sister. I loved how clever he was to leave crumbs behind him, and how happy I was that they could outsmart the horrible witch and free themselves. I thought about how a witch lived in something as pretty as a gingerbread house covered with candy. And I loved the ending where the mean mom has gone away and the dad cries to see his children again and hugs them. They now have all the money they need, and they all live happily ever after. By making an objection to fairy tales, C.S. Lewis said that some mean, quote, "We must try to keep out of the child's mind the knowledge that he is born into a world of death, violence, wounds, adventure, heroism, and cowardice, good and evil." But we are born into a world like that. And when we try to keep our children from that, we're actually handicapping them. Continuing with C.S. Lewis, since it is so likely that they will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Let there be wicked kings and beheadings, battles and dungeons, giants and dragons, and let villains be soundly killed at the end of the book. And then he continues, I think it is possible that by confining your child to blameless stories of child life in which nothing at all alarming ever happens, you would fail to banish the terrors, and would succeed in banishing all that can ennoble them or make them endurable. For in the fairy tales, side by side with the terrible figures, we find the immemorial comforters and protectors, the radiant ones. It would be nice if no little boy in bed, hearing or thinking he hears a sound, were ever at all frightened. But if he is going to be frightened, I think it better that he should think of giants and dragons than merely of burglars. And I think St. George, or any bright champion in armor, is a better comfort than the idea of the police. Close quote. Remember, a child who is listening to a fairy tale is creating his own images, and he's going to soften the images according to what he's comfortable with, which is an advantage over exposing him to some of the darker fairy tales through movies. The great treasury of fairy tales may have vanished altogether had a small army of storytellers not followed inspired impressions to seek out the stories and write them down. They had existed only as oral stories for generations. A large number of fairy tales were tracked down during the golden age of children's literature. The story gatherers visited remote tribes and homes of peasants to find the stories in their purest forms. Then they sifted through them and compiled them into readers looking for those stories that would be most suitable for modern children's ears. Many of the stories came to us from a much more violent culture, and I caution you, yes, do keep an eye open for stories that may not be appropriate to share with young children. It's a fine line. You know your child best. And understand fairy tales are not limited to ages 4 to 8. Let them be lifelong companions. I've tracked down dozens of books of fairy tales from all over the world and organized them by country in the Imaginative Stories online library in the Story Hour series. By reading fairy tales and folk stories from many lands, you begin to help your children get a taste of different cultures around the world. Indulge, but keep in mind fairy tales are rich and sweet. Be sure to add a little meat and potato on their plates, which Bible stories, nature, and classic children's literature can add. We see a lot of fractured fairy tales in our day. We no longer want to let the little piggies get eaten up for their unwise choices. Instead, we invite the poor misunderstood wolf in for dinner rather than doing away with them once and for all. Cinderella, rather than being a great story of forgiveness, gets a twinge of delight in getting even with her stepmother at the end. Maleficent isn't really evil. She's just misunderstood. There aren't many fairy tales we haven't broken yet, and I'm afraid we're undoing the heritage of truth that has been so carefully preserved for us. It's part of our upside-down world. I've wondered at the fact that so many of the stories are about princes and princesses. As I thought about it, a poem my dad taught me came to mind. I am a child of royal birth. My father is king of heaven and earth. I was born in the courts on high, a daughter beloved, a princess am I. As I mentioned previously, I personally believe many of the fairy tales were divinely inspired, and maybe this is meant to be an important part of their message, that each of us has divine worth. The imaginative years are also the time to start introducing mythology, particularly the Greek myths. There are many important truths wrapped in these stories as well, and because references to characters of mythology are found in abundance in much of the great literature children will read later, a knowledge of who they were is vital. I can think of no better introduction to why Greek mythology matters than the one Charles Kingsley wrote in his introduction to The Heroes. It's written to children, and I'd personally start with that introduction. You'll find a section dedicated to Greek mythology in the Story Hour series, and you'll find the heroes in the online library, along with a selection of not only Greek mythology, but mythology of other nations as well. The Norse myths aren't as well known, but if you're not familiar with them, I think you'll really like them too. When the storytellers retold the Greek myths 100 years ago, they understood them with their hearts. I can't really explain how they did it, but when I read their versions, I saw things I never saw before. I really wasn't a fan of Greek mythology until I started reading their versions. I tried to give you a sampling of their styles in the printed volume of Greek mythology in our Story Hour series. I've also prepared a volume with stories from great literature to introduce young children to the stories of Shakespeare, Cervantes, Chaucer, Homer, Spenser, and Dante. The online library in connection with that book will not only give you more stories, the prefaces to the books will help you understand even more their value. Play is the work of childhood. As you read and tell these imaginative stories, be sure and allow for lots of free playtime to act them out. If your child is just one toy, make sure it's a good set of building blocks from which to build castles and forts and villages and homes. You can pick up a bag of wooden peg dolls for just a few dollars online or at the craft store that supply all the people they could possibly need to act out the story. They can be played with just as they are, or with a few scraps of materials or markers, they can be turned into an endless cast of characters. Imaginative play is how children process the stories and drive them deeper into their hearts. Encourage them to act out the stories in little plays. Provide simple props and costumes to spark their imagination. In the resource section, I included a section all about plays. You'll find ideas for putting on little plays with costuming ideas and everything you could possibly need. And you'll even find a variety of plays to be acted out, from very simple ones based on fairy tales to Shakespeare plays for young actors. I've been reading that the list of remedial classes in our schools is growing. We have remedial math and remedial reading, and now schools are finding children have lost the ability to play, and they're scrambling to create remedial play classes. Yet the simple solution is provide them with an abundance of good stories and free time, and then let them play. Around the age of 8, children enter the heroic years. Now they'll use their capacity to visualize to start imagining the person they want to become. At no other time in life will heroes make a bigger impression than the years from age 8 to about age 12. This is also the age for the first big intellectual shift. They now prefer real to pretend. Facts become more important. The transition from their world of make-believe to the real world is the perfect opportunity to introduce legendary and epic heroes who are partially based on legend and partially on fact. They want their first heroes to be action heroes, not moral heroes. So give them Robin Hood, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Beowulf, and Roland. In the Story Hour series, there's a volume filled with introductory stories of the great legendary heroes, and an online library with heroes from lands not covered in the book, as well as additional stories of all their favorites. Don't underestimate the influence of these heroes on young minds. I read of a wealthy woman in England who would bring poor youth out of the city to her country estate to spend some time. This was 100 years ago, not modern times, but human nature doesn't change, so I would expect similar results today. She described that when they first came, their language and behavior was crude and vulgar. But as she told them the stories of knights with shining armor and their oaths of honor, their behavior completely changed and their language became refined. Do you remember the oaths of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table? I will develop my life for the greater good. I will place character above riches and concern for others above personal wealth. I will never boast, but cherish humility instead. I will speak the truth at all times and forever keep my word. I will defend those who cannot defend themselves. I will honor and respect women. I will uphold justice by being fair to all. I will be faithful in love and loyal in friendships. I will abhor scandal and gossip, neither partake nor delight in them. I will be generous to the poor and those who need help. I will forgive when asked, that my own mistakes may be forgiven. I will live my life with courtesy and honor from this day forward. Does chivalry really have to die? And now we enter into the stage when stories from history, biographies, and fine literature will be the main supply of heart food. The objective for studying these subjects in a heart-based education is to give the child an understanding heart, which is the beginning of wisdom. When Solomon was told by the Lord he could have anything he desired, an understanding heart was what he chose, and God was pleased. What other study could possibly be more worthwhile to our children in these years than to study the human heart? And story reveals it. As we fill the reservoir of stories within their hearts, they learn to view life through 1,000 different eyes, rather than through the narrow and limited view of their own experience. Walking in another's shoes is the beginning of empathy. It doesn't mean embracing or accepting different lifestyles, but rather understanding why people act the way they do. To know someone is to love them, and we learn to know someone by learning their stories. A few years ago, the local newspaper ran a series of articles that followed the last days of a convicted killer prior to his execution. The man was brutal in his acts of violence and during the trials had shown absolutely no remorse for what he'd done. For years he sat on death row, and then an ecclesiastical leader befriended him. He listened with an understanding heart and discovered that this killer, from the time he was a baby, never had a single person in his life demonstrate any kind of affection or love. Not one, anywhere. On the contrary, he had been severely emotionally and physically abused throughout childhood and bullied at school. Through this leader, this seemingly heartless killer experienced love for the first time in his life, and it changed him. He made no appeals to save his life. He calmly accepted his sentence as just punishment for the crimes he had committed. But the killer who went to the execution chamber was not the same man who had committed the crimes. I read of another prisoner with a similar story, one who had committed a string of violent and brutal acts with no remorse. It was while he was in prison that a volunteer read a story that somehow connected to his heart, and for the first time in his life, he felt empathy, and it changed him. In our story-deprived world, we see a lot of people trying to operate their lives from a shallow puddle of stories that comes only from their own experience. They have no story to make sense of the raw emotion that pours out of their hearts. They have no story to draw upon that shows their heart the proper release of emotion. They view life through the limited view of their own experience, and thereby lack empathy of people who live differently than they do. Aristotle wrote, "When the storytelling goes bad in society, the result is decadence." The objective of the study of history and literature in heart-based education is to ensure that the reservoir of stories in our children's hearts is broad and deep. This isn't the time to assign and analyze 2 or 3 books a year. You want to allow them plenty of free time to read to their heart's content without intrusion. Help them find books to inspire their hearts, which is what Libraries of Hope is trying to provide. Be ready to engage in discussions, but be aware that sometimes stories need to make a place in their hearts where words often can't reach. When a child learns history through story, several things happen. First, he remembers it, which is critical if we want the lessons of history to operate in his life. Rudyard Kipling said, "If all of history was taught with stories, it would never be forgotten." The pyramids our children build out of sugar cubes or the California missions they carve out of ivory soap may be enjoyable, but without the stories, they're nothing more than fun activities. They are not of themselves a study of history. Neither are the textbook facts and information alone a worthwhile study of history, because they don't move the heart. Secondly, the child's heart, which thrives on patterns, will begin to pick up the patterns of history, the cycles of history, which can then be applied to what's happening in today's world. As Lord Byron said, "There is the moral of all human tales, 'tis but the same rehearsal of the past. First freedom, and then glory. When that fails, wealth, vice, corruption, barbarism at last, and history with all her volumes vast hath but one page. It's going to take time for these patterns to appear, which happens after much reading and pondering. Your child's heart needs to see them for itself. You can't force it. Although how we dress and get around and the kinds of houses we live in all change over time, human nature never changes, and that is the part of history story captures and that the heart recognizes. If the patterns of history are clear in his heart, he will not lose hope even when situations look bleak, because his heart recognizes that spring always follows winter, always. He'll know what to do, no matter where he finds himself in the cycle, because he'll know what's coming next. His hope will be a beacon of light to those around him whose hearts may be failing because they have no stories to draw from. I believe the measure of hope is in direct proportion to how broad and how deep a child's reservoir of stories is. Thirdly, a child who learns history through story will begin to understand his place and role in the world. He will start to realize that he is the connecting link between the past and the future. His heart will begin to understand the price that has been paid by someone else for the blessings he enjoys, and will likewise begin to understand that his choices will not just affect himself, they will ripple down through generations. Just like any story, a child's heart first has to grab hold and keep asking, and then what happened? And then what happened? In order for that story magic to happen, I believe a child needs to be given the story of one nation at a time, rather than intertwined in the beginning. He needs a moving image for the patterns and lessons to emerge. The story needs to move quickly enough that he gets caught up in its flow. The end result will be, when he gets to today, he'll one day realize the story isn't over yet, and he'll find himself right in the middle of it. He will now see himself as one of the actors on the stage, and where the story goes next will in part be determined by him. The role he chooses will be studied by those who read the story in years to come. Will he be selfish and cowardly, or will he make a stand against overwhelming odds? Will his contribution be a part of lifting the world, or of tearing it down? Will he be one of those shining stars who change the course of history? If he has immersed himself in the stories of history, his heart understands well the power of the individual. One person can and does make a difference. History is nothing more than a record of the influence of individual hearts. The reading of great biographies is what will instruct his heart best on the role he is to play. Surround him with the diamond souls of history. Let his heart be taught by the greatest scientists, writers, artists, musicians, humanitarians, kings and queens, explorers, philanthropists, and inventors who have ever lived. Let these be his best friends. They will show his heart the price he must pay for greatness. As I've gathered their stories for our books, I feel just like Plutarch did when he said, "My original purpose in writing lives of the great was to teach others, but I found more and more that I am the one who gets the most profit from lodging these men one after another in my house. The virtues of these great men, and I will add women, serve me as a sort of looking glass. In it I may see how to adjust and adorn my own life. Through daily living and associating with them, I perceive all their qualities and select all that are noblest and worthiest." The lessons of great lives come to my mind in every challenge I face. I feel surrounded and lifted up by them, and so will your children. Be aware that there was a major shift in biographies 100 years ago as the world started turning upside down. Biographers started zeroing in on and magnifying the flaws and the weaknesses of their subjects. Like gossips, they tried to expose the scandals. Before that time, biographers wrote to inspire and uplift hearts by focusing on the positive and the good. One of the main goals of our Forgotten Classics Family Library is to give you an abundance of inspiring stories of great men and women for your children's hearts to feed on. We can only be lifted to higher ground by someone who is standing on higher ground himself. It is from studying lives that your child's heart will now start to recognize and learn the rules of happy and abundant living, because even happiness is dependent on its rules. Fine literature written by people who view life from higher places than the rest of us serves the same purpose. Fictional literature can bring events of history to life, where the heart can examine it more clearly. The understanding heart understands himself and others, understands the world around him, and understands his place in it. And above all, the understanding heart understands the rules of happiness. Civilization thrives when its people are happy. Historical reading started in the heroic years is the key to an understanding heart. From my notes, a taste for historical reading is, after all, the valuable gift we can bestow upon our youthful student of history. Having given him that, we may safely leave the rest to him. I'll be giving more ideas for helping our children develop a taste for historical reading and showing you where to find stories that inspire in the talks on the Story Resource Guide, Notebooking, and Story Clubs. And now we're to the end of another talk. I started this talk on stories with an experience shared by Margaret Eggleston, and I think I'll end it with another one of her experiences. She was asked if storytelling really was worth the effort. She responded, of course, with a story. One day she told a story to a group of adolescent boys, among which was a hoodlum. She didn't think he was even paying attention to the story. It was a story of a young boy who had a job sweeping up a bank at closing time. As he went to empty one of the trash cans, he noticed a large roll of money that had accidentally been thrown away. As he held it in his hands, he thought how much this money would mean to his family. His father was an alcoholic who spent most of what he earned on drinking. The little bit of money this boy brought home went towards food for his little crippled sister and his mother, who was very ill. The doctor had told him that if he didn't find a way to get medicine for his mother and move her out to the country where she could get fresh air, she probably wouldn't live past the fall. He looked around and saw that no one had noticed him, so he slipped the money in his pants pocket and headed home. Along the way, the money felt heavier and heavier in his pocket. He moved it first to his outside jacket pockets and then to the inside pocket. But the closer he got to home, the heavier the money felt, until he at last realized he just couldn't keep the money. He headed back to the bank where a security guard let him in. He marched straight to the bank president's office, knocked on the door, walked in, and threw the money across the desk to the president, explaining how he had come by it. The president looked surprised. "Son," he said, "I know how much this money would mean to you and your mother. No one knew you had it. Why did you bring it back?" Without hesitating, the boy leaned across the desk and, looking straight into the eyes of the president, said, "Sir, as long as I live, I have to live with myself, and I don't want to live with a thief." That was the story. There had been no particular reaction to it, and Margaret lost contact with this young man until years later when she received a letter from him. He was now a soldier fighting on the war front in France. As she opened it, she read, "Years ago, on a wet and rainy day, when the ice was dangerous on the sidewalk, you came and told a story to a group of boys." I don't remember the details of the story, but I remember how it ended. "As long as I live, I have to live with myself, and I don't want to live with a thief." That one story has kept me from lying and stealing and from being a coward, and here in France, it has kept me true to my manhood. I have a class here in the barracks. I know that may be hard to believe, and some of my men need that story. I want it for all of them. For all that I am, I owe to that one story, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Stories can heal our world. Never underestimate the power of a story.